Hi, my name is Justin Allen, and I'm here to teach you about biology. Biology comes from the Greek roots bios, meaning life, and logia, meaning study of. Therefore, biology is the study of life. Biology covers many different topics, going from the little small single-celled organisms that you can't even see, to the inner workings of your body, to the habitats that you live in, and this applies to all other organisms as well. Biologists study how our brains work, how our reproductive systems work, everything. But before we get into biology, let's take a look at what science itself is. Science comes from the Latin word scientia, meaning to know. Science is an objective, logical, and repeatable attempt to understand the forces and principles operating in our universe. Science should never be seen as a certain thing because it's constantly changing and new things can be discovered with technological advancements. Science is conducted using the scientific method, which consists of observations, hypothesis, experiment, collecting data, and drawing a conclusion. So observation is just looking at something and coming to a hypothesis about it, what you think is going on. Then you form your hypothesis around what goes on in the observations. Then you experiment and test it to see what's going on. And then you collect your data and try and figure out what's going on with it, and then draw a conclusion about whether your hypothesis was right, needs some modification, or is just completely wrong. There are three kinds of scientific ideas. These are the hypothesis, which is the most common and the least certain. Theories, which are like hypotheses, but they have a lot more evidence and proof to support them, and they've been around for a while and haven't been changed too much. And laws, which are fundamental principles of the universe. So basically, without laws, if laws were wrong, everything would be messed up in the world. An example of a hypothesis would be to say, okay, observation. I'm looking at a camera right now recording a video. Hypothesis, someone might watch this video. Experiment, post it online for people to see. Collecting data, look at the comments and the amount of views on the page. Draw a conclusion from that. So either someone did not, or a few people saw this video. I apologize if I look down. I do have notes here. Unfortunately, I don't have a perfect photographic memory like some of you might. Okay, next we're going to talk about the levels of organization, which consists of the biosphere, which is all living organisms together and what they live in, everything that allows them to live. The environments, which is the relationships of smaller groups within a habitat. And community, which is the different interactions of animals, just that, not the habitat. A species, which is a group of similar individuals who are able to reproduce with each other and how they interact with each other. Populations, which is a group of similar individuals in the same geographical area. So a species can be worldwide as long as they're able to theoretically reproduce with each other. But a population has to actually be within the same range that they can interact and reproduce with each other. Then the individual, which is categorized by unique DNA information arrangements. So you are a very unique individual. All of us are. It doesn't mean you're any more important, but you're unique. Good job. Okay, now we're going to talk about taxonomy. Taxonomy was started by Carl Linné, also known as Linnaeus, because at the time it was considered the cool thing to name learned men Latin names, so they turned Linné into Linnaeus. And he tried to categorize organisms into unchanging groups, many of which are still used. His classification system was based on a species or taxon being the smallest rank, and then each rising rank would have more organisms in that group. And so it goes in this order: species, then to genus, and then order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain, life. So species is the lowest, life is the highest. So I'm going to talk about what humans are classified as. We are cellular life as opposed to non-cellular life, which would be viruses. However, that's purely theoretical at this point in time. And then we belong to the eukarya domain as opposed to archaea or bacteria, which are composed only of single-celled organisms, and we are obviously multicellular. And then we find the kingdom Animalia, which is one of 5 kingdoms, however, we'll talk about that in just a little bit, which is what animals fall under. And then we are part of the Chordata phylum, which is made up of vertebrates. And then we're part of the Mammalia class, which is all mammals. And then we're part of the primates, which is, us, gorillas, chimpanzees, etc. Those types of animals, opposable thumbs. And then we are part of the Hominidae family, part of the Homo genus and Sapiens species. Another thing Lynn did is he came up with binomial nomenclature, which is using 2 names to identify an animal, so this could be determined worldwide. He used Latin for these names because at the time it was the language of academics, so he decided on Latin. So our name would be Homo sapiens because our genus is Homo and our species is Sapiens. Now we're going to talk about the 5 kingdoms that I mentioned earlier. The first one is Monera, which is made up of bacteria, and they're all prokaryotes, meaning they have no membrane-bound organelles. And then the second is Protista, which is made up of plankton, algae, and protozoa, which are the first eukaryotes, and have animal-like behavior. And then fungi is obviously composed of fungus. They're all heterotrophic, meaning they take their energy from others. They can have up to 2 nuclei, which is unique to them. We can't have cells with more than 1 nuclei, neither can any of the other kingdoms. And there's the Plantae, which is composed of plants, mostly photosynthetic and autotrophic, which means they get their energy from the sun and turn it into usable energy for themselves, and they don't have to feed off of others to get energy. But there are exceptions, such as the Venus flytrap. And then there's Animalia, which is composed of animals. They're all heterotrophs, all mobile, and we are ecologically consumers. So let's talk about ecology for a bit. Ecology starts with a producer, such as a plant, grass, for example. And then there's a consumer, the primary consumer, such as a cow, let's say, that eats that grass. Then there's a secondary consumer, which let's say is a wolf, which eats that. And then a tertiary consumer, which let's say there's someone who likes to eat wolves. So if the tertiary consumer is a human, kills the wolf, eats that. And then let's say humans don't have anything hunting them in this case, so that's where the line ends. However, it can go up to 8 or 9 different organisms being part of a single one-line chain. And next is the characteristics of living things, which are organization, so multicellular organisms into cells, cells into organelles, what we talked about earlier, just getting smaller and smaller categories. Homeostasis, which is the maintenance of a constant yet dynamic internal environment in terms of temperature, pH, water balance, etc. Adaptivity, which means living things are suited to their mode of existence. Reproduction, which means that they are able to create offspring, whether it is through asexual means, which is basically cloning, and sexual means, which is mating with another of the same species and creating an offspring with a new genetic makeup. And then they are able to grow and develop. They can acquire energy, so as we mentioned in ecology, they eat the producers, that's acquiring energy, and they're able to release it through motion or heat or giving energy to others when they're eaten. And then detection and response to stimuli, which basically means response to any physical or chemical change detected by the nervous system. And then interactions, which just means interacting with each other, with their environments, with different species, etc. And now we're going to talk about theories contributing to modern biology. There are 4 of these. They are cell theory, inheritance, homeostasis, and evolution. So cell theory started with Robert Hooke in 1653 when he put a piece of cork, not the ball stoppers, but it's a type of bark, under a microscope and saw that they had small cavities, which he called cells, which is Latin for chambers. After this, in 1838, came Matthias Schneiden, who concluded that all plant tissues were made up of cells. 1 year later, Theodor Schwann said that all animal tissues were made of cells, and then 20 years later, in 1858, Rudolf Virchow said that both plants and animal tissues were all made up of cells, and that cells could only come from pre-existing cells. He wasn't sure how, but he figured that, hey, this little cell makes this cell. Now you have two cells. And then together all these ideas form cell theory. And next we're going to talk about inheritance. Inheritance started with Gregor Mendel and his experiments on peas. He tested two factors. He tested their color and their texture. The two colors he used were green and yellow, and textures were smooth and wrinkled. And he concluded that mixing these traits created new outcomes as far as genetics. He is cited as the father of modern genetics, so he is a very important person, and we'll talk about him more in the future. Next is Watson and Crick, who developed the model for DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, which at the time had been discovered to be the carrier of genetic information. Crick also hypothesized a mechanism for DNA replication. There are three of these: semi-conservative replication, conservative replication, and duplicative replication. He forms semi-conservative replication, and I'll put a picture of that up right here. He also created the central dogma, which states that information cannot be passed from protein to protein or protein to nucleic acid. So, information is passed from DNA and then turned into RNA, a form that RNA can read, and then messenger RNA sends it to proteins, then it's stored in proteins until it can be used. And then next is homeostasis, which we mentioned briefly earlier. It is the maintenance of a dynamic range of factors within an organism that allow it to function properly. Energy, pH balance, temperature, water balance are all examples of factors that play a role in maintaining homeostasis. And then thermodynamics is a field of study dealing with the laws that govern energy of transfer, making it the basis of all life on Earth. The two laws of thermodynamics, or two of the laws of thermodynamics, are laws of conservation and mass and energy, and entropy, which that's not really my forte, so I'll allow someone else to talk about that on this site. Next is evolution, probably one of the most controversial subjects in all of science. Evolution started with Anaximander, a Greek philosopher, and Lucretius, a Roman philosopher, who both came up with the idea that all life originates from the same place and organisms change over time. Later, Aristotle created the ladder of life, which showed how he thought life escalated from inanimate objects to plants to animals and eventually to humans. After him was James Ussher, who calculated the age of the Earth using the genealogies in the Book of Genesis and dated the creation of the Earth back to October 22nd, 4004 BC. Of course, now we think the Earth is a lot older than that. However, this was taken as factual at the time because it was a very religious time in the world, and it didn't interfere with any religions. If anything, it helped them, it added on to them, so it was accepted as a fact by the world. However, there's some people that disagreed with him, like Leonardo da Vinci, a very famous man. You may have heard of him. He is the painter of the Mona Lisa, as well as the Last Supper. He conducted experiments involving the sedimentation rates of the Po River in Italy, and he came to the conclusion that some of the rock deposits were over 200,000 years old, so a lot more than, 4,000, 6,000, a lot more. And then after him was Galileo Galilei, who is a very famous astronomer and was convicted for saying that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but rather there is the sun for the solar system. He also studied fossils and concluded that they were evidence of other life forms before what we knew, which made the Earth seem older, which of course people were not happy about. After him was James Hutton, a man considered to be the father of modern geology. He developed the theory of uniformitarianism, the basis of modern geology and paleontology. Uniformitarianism states that all processes that happen now have occurred in the past and have always been like that. And the modern age of Earth, which we've been talking about a bit, is thought to be around 4.5 billion years old, using the rates of radioactive isotopes such as uranium-238. And the oldest rocks discovered on Earth are 3.96 billion years old. So once again, a lot more than 4,000 years or 6,000 years. And development of the modern view of evolution. Georges Louis Leclerc Comte, which means count in French, de Buffon, proposed that species could change. Then after him was Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who said that they could change over time, but he didn't know how. And then there was Abraham Gottlob Werner and Baron Georges Cuvier, who were some of the more passionate advocates of catastrophism, which is the idea that life in geological formations originate after some catastrophic event, such as Noah's flood, or maybe giant volcano, giant meteors, something like that maybe. That's what they thought. And a man named Louis Agassiz proposed 50 to 80 catastrophes took place in Earth. And then Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck proposed inheritance of acquired characteristics, and this was one of the first theories on how species changed. He believed that animals changed their bodies while they were alive and were somehow able to pass these new traits on to their offspring. So, an example of this would be a giraffe's ancestor somehow making its neck longer, having offspring, and then giving birth to giraffes that now have longer necks than their ancestors. Or say, for some reason, I felt it imperative to get a new finger, so I just get a new finger right here, and I'm like, yay! 6 fingers for some reason, and then I can pass that on to my offspring. That's what he believes. And now we're going on to a man you may have heard of before, named Charles Darwin. Darwin traveled on the HMS Beagle as an unpaid naturalist to the ship's crew thanks to the intervention of his geology teacher. And Darwin traveled and examined different kinds of birds on the Galapagos Islands, and although they had different traits, he still believed they were very closely related, and he wanted to figure out why species that were so similar changed and lived so close to each other and stuff like that. Darwin's hypothesis of evolution was made up of 4 main points, which are adaptation, variation, over-reproduction, and natural selection. Adaptation states that all organisms adapt to their environments. Variation states that all organisms are variable in their traits. Over-reproduction means all species tends to reproduce beyond their environment's capacity to support them. And natural selection means some animals are not as well adapted to their environments and die, whereas some are better adapted, survive, and have offspring with traits more fitted to their environments. There was also a man named Alfred Russel Wallace who had concurrently developed his own theory of natural selection at the same time as Darwin, and he contracted malaria and sent a letter to Darwin detailing his findings, which mirrored Darwin's own ideas. Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species Through Means of Natural Selection 1 year later in 1859. I will put a link to that below, and the main additions to the theory since its creation are genetics and DNA, or what is called modern synthesis. But it has mostly remained the same, and evolution is regarded as modern biology's guiding theory.